This is an odd question, isn't it, for a lot of people in our society today? Can we test religions? They don't even understand the question because they say, well, here's where I am. Well, they don't say that. But this is where they are, many of them, right? When it comes to religious things, it's like, I don't know. They stutter. They have no idea where to go with that particular topic. When you say, can't we evaluate religions? They don't want to go that direction, right? They're stuck in this bad intersection of unclear and perplexed and confused and all that kind of stuff. They may even know the story, and if they don't know the story, they would certainly understand the story of the blind men and the elephant. And you've probably heard it before, but the idea is that in India, some little part of India, some little city, somebody for the first time has brought an elephant into the community. And so these blind men are led to understand what an elephant is. Well, one grabs the tail, probably not a great idea, but anyway, he grabs the tail and he goes, oh, okay, so an elephant's a rope, I get it. And the other one says, well, wait a minute. And he's feeling along the wall, you can see him, he calls it a wall. Somebody else grabs a leg and says, well, you're both wrong, it's like a pillar, what's wrong with you? And so the bickering starts, and another guy chimes in, he's at the front, he's grabbed this tusk, and he says, how can you say that? It's a spear. Somebody else is grabbing the trunk and says, oh, it's like a big snake. And another one's grabbing one of the ears and says, you're all crazy. This thing is a huge fan. And can you see there's utter confusion? That's where we are with that intersection before. So a lot of people really relate closely to this story. They say, well, yeah, that's the way it is today with religions. People are touching different things in religious matters, and there's this huge division, and smoke is going everywhere, and dust is flying, and nobody really has the truth. And in the story, a Raja comes on the scene and says, what's all the bickering about? And he says, well, you guys just have a little piece of the truth. You don't have the whole truth. The elephant is actually, and then he fills in the details. But a lot of people feel like they're those blind guys, right? They're just kind of groping, and why bother? Somebody needs to do something to help these guys out, right? That's the way they feel. Maybe you hear things like this. Well, yeah, okay, you pick this religion, I pick that religion. Pick something that resonates with you, right? So it's kind of like eating in a all-you-can-eat buffet line. You know, well, I'll take some of that, and I'll take some of that, and maybe I'll try that over there, right? That's kind of the attitude today. Don't look at it for truth. You're looking at it for how it makes you feel. And maybe you've heard the comment, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. Right? There's something bad about religions that's too confusing. I'll just gin up some feelings inside of me. How can you tell? Who can say? Right? These are the kinds of comments that come out. Here's another illustration. Sometimes you'll see, well, all roads will lead to God anyway, so why do we sit here and worry about it? So in this example, this illustration, you've got Islam, you've got Christianity, and you've got Hinduism, and they're all kind of going their own way, and they may even kind of look over at the other one saying, you're not getting anywhere, you're zigzagging off, but eventually, guess where they all end up? God at the top. So let's not argue about these things. We're all going to end up okay anyhow. So we're back to the idea of why bother testing religions if we're all going to end up in the same place anyway? But you know, it's interesting, if you go to a pharmacist, you don't hear this, do you? Does he or she lay out the pills and say, pick ones that resonate with you? I know you've got a terrible disease, but I don't know. If it's me, I'd go for the yellow because I kind of like the bright, cheery color, but maybe you're more interested in the capsules, you know, because they look kind of official. They look more serious. Go for those pills. You don't hear that. It's only in religious matters that we're told, it's up to you. Pick something that resonates. You will not get that message if you go to a pharmacist. So why do we treat religion differently? Why do we treat it that way? Well, this is kind of a sociological issue, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I think there are a lot of reasons that people tend to put religions in a different category than things like medicines. And so I just made a short list of this. Frankly, I think it's mental laziness. Phil and I were talking before this session that people don't think. They honestly don't think much about anything anymore. They don't get an education. I know that because I've seen kids in the college level who've come through. These are not English as second language speakers. These are people who've been in our system for all these years. They've come through elementary and junior high, high school, now they're out of college. And we read something and I'll say, do you recognize that name? Zip, dead silence. They don't know World War II. They don't know where we are in relationship to other places within the country. They don't know history, culture. They don't know much of anything. And they're not really taught to be critical thinkers. Unfortunately, a lot of schools today are heading toward propaganda rather than information. You're probably aware of that. And it's only propaganda from a particular viewpoint. So it's kind of sad. Nobody's really a critical thinker anymore. We've got a new definition of tolerance, I think, that's causing some of the problem too. We used to say tolerance was, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I will honor you and treat you with respect. But I will fight you on the details of what you believe, because we're searching for truth, right? Somewhere out there is truth. Let's get to it as best as we can. That's gone, right? Now we have a new tolerance that says all ideas are equally valuable and we're supposed to embrace them all. So again, why would we argue? Why would you test a religion? That makes no sense. Because all religions are the same. We're going to lift them up and put them all on the same playing field. I think there's been a loss of faith in religions as well. People just don't trust them anymore. We hear these terrible accusations, pedophiles and things like that. So it's understandable, but people don't feel as committed as they used to. The nons are growing as far as a percent of our population. Postmodernism has come along and said, why, and I'm in the field of English and literature, and it's just rampant in that area. It's like, if you look at Moby Dick, you have to look at it as a queer study, or you have to look at it as a feminist piece, and you're going, no, I think it's a whaling story, but you know, you're not supposed to do that. You make of it whatever you want, right? That's the postmodern view. There's no truth, no capital T truth. Everybody's got their own truth. Every culture, every person's got his or her own truth. I always thought that'd be interesting, by the way, to take a postmodern text that somebody's written and say to the author, go find the author and say, so you think Jesus is really the Messiah? And he would say, no, that's not what I wrote. And they'd say, well, that's what I think it says, and see what happens. It's pretty self-destructive, but it's out there in our society. And then multiculturalism. What does multiculturalism say? That Western societies and other societies are all kind of, again, on that same wavelength, right? They're all kind of the same thing. We're not going to criticize any other society. So I think those are some of the reasons that we're in this kind of a situation that we are today. Some people say, well, I'll tell you the problem. There's just too many religions to study, right? You go through the yellow pages. Boy, does that date me, huh? Does anybody use yellow pages anymore? All right, anyway, you find a list somewhere of churches that's just overwhelming. There's so many churches out there. And they say it's too hard to figure it out. Well, let's go back to our illustration of the pharmacist and the pills. Is that what a pharmacist says? Oh, there's so many pills. Again, let's just go back. Pick the ones you like. Well, that's not what a pharmacist says, right? The pharmacist organizes them by types. You can do the same thing with religions. It's really not an untold multitude of religions. They fit under different categories, don't they? You've got some that are Eastern that say, basically, you have an impersonal being out there, and then you got the secularists that's a religion, but they say there is no being out there. And then you've got the Abrahamic faiths, that'd be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that say there's a personal being out there. So, I mean, that's one place that you can begin to categorize and look at them as groups. But I want to do something a little bit different today. And this is where the majority of the time is going to be spent on 4 different ways, and now your outline will probably kick in, 4 different ways that we're going to look at religious systems to evaluate them, to test them, to say how do they match up with each other in these areas. And so a lot of people are going to scratch their heads who are not Christians, and they're going to see that first one and they say, really? You're going to talk facts? I didn't think there were any facts involved in religious matters, and there are. So we're going to spend a little time on facts, and I subdivided that up because we're going to spend a lot of time on science and history and then the founders. So we're going to take a look at them. It's fair game, right? It's fair to look at these things. Then we're going to look for logical consistency, right? Do these things make you scratch your head and say, but that doesn't make logical sense as far as claims that are made? So we'll look at it in just a minute and see that. And how about ethics and human nature? What do they say about what people are and how we're supposed to live our lives? There are vast differences, and I think as we weigh them and look at them, we're going to see some are superior to others. And then finally, how is it that you lead that life? I mean, how satisfying is it for an individual to lead that life? So those are going to be the 4 areas that we're going to look at. How are we doing so far? Anybody have a question or comment or But I mean, if you have a question as we're going through, wave at me. I'm happy to honor that. So let's start with facts. We're going to look at 3 different areas of facts. Science. Really? Science and religion? Yeah. And then the history of the religion and the texts that are used to support those religions. And then finally, we're going to look at the founders of each of these religions. Now, this is obviously a huge topic, yes? it's enormous. So there's no way I can do it satisfactorily. I can't take all major religions and line them up with each other. I'm just going to be picking and choosing just to let you see that, yeah, I guess we can make some choices and see some differences and see some superiorities and some weaknesses. So that's all I'm trying to do today. I'm not trying to bring in every single religion and put them all up here to talk about. I just can't do it. Let's start with science. Let's take the area of archaeology, right? Digging around in the past. How does the Bible do, right? The Christians base their beliefs on Old Testament as well as New Testament. How is it done as far as archaeology? Well, they're digging all the time and they keep coming up with more and more things. And the critics have had to keep backstepping because they've made claims. For example, they said, well, there's no such thing as the Hittite Empire. That was like 100, 150 years ago. No such thing as the Hittite Empire. And then they dug up the Hittite Empire. They said, well, okay, there's no Hittites, but there's no proof that the Jews were ever in Egypt. Well, they found things. Do you know there are architectural buildings that are Canaanite kinds of buildings right in the area where the Jews lived or were claimed by the Bible to have lived? They found Semitic names of people in households as slaves in the Egyptian language in the Egyptian cities. They had Semitic slaves. Of course, they found wall panels showing Semites traveling and all. They found something called the Ipuwer fragment, which is a Egyptian story that talks about the Nile turning red and talking about different kinds of plagues. And some people, and it's kind of iffy, but some people think that may have been part of the Exodus story. There are letters, desperate letters, sent by people who were kings in the land of Canaan, sending back to Egypt saying, come help us, we're being invaded by other groups of people. Well, it's probably the Jews. They call them the Hebrew, which is pretty close to Hebrews, right? So a lot of people think they're worrying because here come the Jews. And then in something like 1200 BC, a pharaoh has a big stone monument that says, I came into Canaan and I laid Israel waste. His seed is no more. Well, of course, he got that wrong. But, I mean, do you see what's going on there? Israel is actually mentioned as being in the land in 1200 BC. And they've just found these things over the last 50, 75 years as they've done this kind of digging. So it's pretty impressive stuff, right? So we can go through, let's take Jerusalem and David. Well, okay, so the critic has backed up and said, well, all right, so maybe there's some evidence there. But Jerusalem was never anything big, and David was non-existent, right? There's no such person as David. Well, they've been doing a lot of archaeology. They found Jerusalem was much bigger than they expected, and they found references to David. They found the palace of David, parts of that. And so they're having to, if you're a critic, you're having to back up and say, well, okay, and go from there. Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, 3 big empires. Isn't it nice they did it alphabetically? That's the only way I can remember them, right? A, B, and then P, all right? So otherwise I get a little mixed up. But what happened? Well, the Assyrians kept track of their own records. And when you read the Bible accounts, you hear about Sennacherib, right? And there's Sennacherib. He's got his own document about what he did. I'll give you a quick example. I think this is fascinating. He says he came into the Jerusalem area and he said, I caged up Hezekiah like a bird. But you know what he doesn't say? He doesn't say, I defeated him. He says, I just put him in a cage. Yeah, because that's that story, that famous story about the angel of God coming along and wiping out the Assyrians. They had to leave. So I thought it was really interesting that a guy whose ultimate power is such that he could have said anything he wanted. And this document was supposed to talk about how great he is as he wrote this stuff or had them write this stuff. But he was truthful. He actually had to say, I didn't defeat him. I didn't capture him. I didn't kill off everybody in the city. He said, I just trapped him like a bird in a cage. So the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, they all have records. Cyrus, for example, the Persian. Cyrus has got a record about letting the people go back to the land. That's what the Bible says. And so again and again and again, you hear these things connecting the truth of the Bible with the things going on in other empires as we look through their libraries and their collections of information. Let's move to the New Testament. There are famous historians, a guy named Albright, for example, who looked at Luke as a historian. And he started out as a cynic. He didn't think Luke got his facts right. And he studied what Luke said, and he studied other sources of information. He came to the conclusion that Luke was an amazing historian. Luke got his sailing right, he got the ports right, he got the winds right, he got the geography right, he got even the names of the, whoever was in charge in these cities. They all had different names, because they were like city-states. So here we're pretty, everything's uniform, right? They have mayors everywhere, but back then you had different names, Greek names for whoever was in charge, and Luke got them right, city after city after city. And so people now say, well, he's an amazing historian. How about John? John said that there was this pool of Bethesda. Maybe you remember the story that the angel would come and stir the waters. And they said there were 5 colonnades, 5 columns that stood there. Well, then 70 AD, here come the Romans. They wipe out Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a shambles. If you're writing this hundreds of years later, you wouldn't know how many colonnades there were. Now they've done archaeological digs there, and guess how many colonnades they found? Not 4, not 6, they found 5. So all these things are going on that make you think, the Bible seems to be doing pretty well archaeologically. Well, can we match that up now? Can we talk about other texts? Let's take the Book of Mormon. That's a pretty easy target, right? When you look at those two and you say, are they really equal? Are we going to test them and say, man, there's no real difference? The Book of Mormon is way off. I was just looking, I've got a copy at home just for reference purposes. I double checked. Somebody told me they never have maps in their Bible, so I looked it up, their Book of Mormon. There's no map in the back. How come? Because they can't find anything. Right? They said there were millions of people living in Central and South America, and there's this huge flourishing civilization. They go into this extreme detail about this, but you can't find any of it. And then they said there's this huge battle at Hill Cumorah in New York. You can't find any trace of that. So where are these millions of people? They got the culture wrong, they got the cities wrong, they got the agricultural products wrong that they talked about in there. So how does that match up with the Bible's excellent archaeological proof? Not so well. Maybe some of you are familiar with a magazine, by the way, called Biblical Archaeology Review, BAR. That's interesting. It's not written from a Christian perspective, but it gets into some of these archaeological things. Let's take another area of science. How about cosmology? Meaning study of the universe, the cosmos. So what does the Bible say? It says that at one time, right, one time in the past there was a creation event. God said, let there be light, right? And so out of nothing, ex nihilo, out of nothing comes matter, space, time, and energy. Out of nothing. Well, since that statement, right, science poo-pooed it for a while, but they've now pretty much agreed that there really was a Big Bang, as they called it. And that Big Bang, by definition, is an expanding universe, right? It's not just God created everything as it is. It seems like, according to all the science today, that the universe is expanding. Galaxies are flying away from each other. Kind of like you were to take a balloon, put dots on it, right? Blow the balloon up, and those dots are going to appear to recede. And every dot is going to think it's in the center, right? Because everything looks like it's moving away from that dot. But that's the kind of universe that we're living in, an expanding universe. And look at these 3 references, and there are more than those 3 that I've got up here, but there are 3 references that say that exact thing, that there appears to be an expanding universe. Job 9, Psalm 104, Isaiah 40 all suggest the stretching, right, the expansion of the universe, that the fabric is increasing of the universe. Now, match that up, right, as far as how science, as far as cosmology in the Bible, with something like Hinduism. Hinduism says it's an eternal universe, it's just cyclical. Well, that's not what science is saying, so I would say in that case, we've got one that's not matching up very well and one that's matching up a lot better with cosmology. What about biology? I'm not aware of any biological problems that the Bible has indicated, but if you take something like the book for Islam, the Quran, it says human beings are formed from a clot of blood. Quote, then we made the sperm into a clot of congealed blood, then of the clot we made a lump, which is the fetus. That's not biology. That's not accurate biology. So if you look at those two, you go, well, one seems a little shy of the truth here. How about astronomy? What does Job say? That the earth is hung upon nothing. Right? There's nothing underneath. It's not elephants all the way down. Right? So it's just hanging there. The Quran says one traveled west until when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting in a muddy spring. Oops. That's not good science. So if you look at those two again, you say, well, I'll go with the Bible. That sounds stronger to me than something like the Quran. Let's keep moving. Psychology and psychiatry. Christianity, they've done study after study, it seems to lead to a much more satisfying life. And then you take something like Scientology. How does that do in the area of psychiatry? Well, they're very suspicious of psychiatrists. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder, equated psychiatrists with terrorists. Really. The APA, I'm going to go down the list here so I can go through this a little more quickly. The APA has warned of potential danger of their so-called cures. Quote, the claims are not supported by empirical evidence. So it doesn't do what it says it is trying to do. JAMA, which is the Journal for the American Medical Association, said it's a mind-healing cult. Not a very positive review of that, huh? Let's move to history then. Anybody have a question about as far as the sciences go? Okay, so I want to give you time if you have any questions. And we'll have time at the end too if you want to talk about something. How about, let's move to the second area then, which is history. So let's talk manuscripts for a minute. Obviously you can do a whole talk about the New Testament manuscripts, but the New Testament is, it has, as one author said, it's an embarrassment of riches as far as the manuscripts. I assume everybody here knows that we do not have the originals. They're not sitting in the Vatican someplace or Washington or London. We do not have the book of Mark or Matthew or any of those Gospels. We have copies. So then, if that's the case, that all we have are copies, and that's true for Plato, it's just true for Thucydides, for Homer, for everybody, right? We just have copies. So if that's the case for all ancient literature, we don't have the original, they just crumbled away over time, then does it make sense that you want to have the most copies possible? Why would you want hundreds rather than 5, for example? What's the advantage? Agreement. Right? If every one of them is saying something completely different, you're just in a world of hurt, right? Because you don't know what the original said. If you can see over and over again that they tend to say the same thing, maybe a spelling error here, a punctuation error here, or whatever it is. Like let's say you were trying to find a recipe from your dear aunt who passed away, and it was something that everybody loved, they really wanted it, and they said, well, she sent me a copy, and somebody said, well, she sent me a copy, and so Tenet, you sit down and you smooth out your letters from your dear aunt. You could probably reconstruct it, even if she put teaspoon in one place, but she meant to put tablespoon, because you'd see enough copies that said tablespoon. Does that make sense, that you could figure out? So you want a lot of copies. And the other thing you want to do is you want your copies to be as close to the original as possible, so you have less chance for copying error. Does that make sense too? So those are the two things that you're going to look at, and we'll talk about different religions in a minute, but those are the two things you want when it comes to manuscripts: an abundance and as close as possible. And Christianity is strong on both of those. We have thousands of manuscripts to look at. And somebody once said, even if you destroyed all those manuscripts, you have the early church fathers, really close to that time period, that quoted from Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. You could reconstruct the New Testament anyway. So we've got thousands of copies. We've got them close to the time of Jesus. They're written by eyewitnesses. I don't have time to go into that, but there are a lot of reasons to believe these are eyewitnesses. The things like John mentioning the porticos or whatever, there are a lot of things going on there that suggest they were written by eyewitnesses. Sometime, if you have a chance, look at what are called creeds that are found in Paul's letters. Paul had creeds that were like easy to memorize statements of faith buried inside of his letters. They're not written by him. In fact, he says, I'm just passing this along to you. And if you look at those creeds, some people think those creeds go back to the first year after the death of Jesus. They go that far back just because of the way they're structured and the language usage and all of this. So they say those go back, and you notice, if you look at those creeds, they say the same thing as the Gospels about the life of Jesus. So they match up, right? So apparently we've got eyewitness testimony. A lot of reasons for that. There's a new book out, not new now, but it's called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Bauckham. It's a pretty thick book, but it's an excellent book that really reinforces the things we're talking about here about these 4 Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. The differences, yeah, there are a few differences in the manuscripts. They're really unimportant. Bart Ehrman makes you worry about this. Bart Ehrman is a scholar who says, we have hundreds of thousands of differences. And then he just stops, as if you're supposed to say, I don't know anything, I guess. I don't know if Jesus lived, if he never said anything that he said. Maybe he didn't really rise from the dead. Maybe all these gospel fragments contradict each other. Well, what he doesn't tell you is, yeah, there are a lot of these differences, but there are things like Christ Jesus and Jesus Christ. And he calls that a difference. Yeah, it is a difference. Does that matter? No. Or he'll say, in some places, an author will say, the Mary, instead of just Mary. It's some weird Greek construction. That doesn't change anything. There's not been any kind of gospel piece found that ever says Jesus didn't live, Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Jesus wasn't born of a virgin. None of the core doctrines of Christianity are affected. And I actually have read Ehrman, he's actually admitted that, but when he does his debates, he loves this flashy stuff about hundreds of thousands of errors, or differences, but they're unimportant, right? Sometimes it's spelling, okay, but you still know who they're talking about. Sometimes it's word order. Doesn't matter. The basic facts are there, right? So as far as manuscripts go, we're in really good shape as far as Christianity. It's strong evidence that we have an accurate version of what really was written. Well, what about the Quran? It claims to tell us about the life of Jesus, but what are we talking about? We have a gap, don't we? 600 plus years for the Quran to tell us about Jesus. I'm going to take the stories that came from Jesus' time period, from within the first 50, 75 years after Jesus' life. I'm going to take those as far better eyewitness reports than something that comes 600 years later. I don't think that matches up very well. And I think something even worse, though, is what's happened to the Quran itself as far as real credibility. And that's a historical deal. In the 7th century, the late 7th century, as Islam is spreading, the Quran is, of course, going out into these different communities, and people are reporting back to the Caliph. They're saying, we've got Qurans that say very different things. Well, that's not good, right? They actually contradicted each other, and so his solution was, gather them all up and let's destroy them all, and we'll call this one the original or the good one, and we'll go with that. We'll make copies of that. Well, how do they know whether they got the right one or not? Right? I mean, there's some problems. I've heard now, I can't verify this, so I won't go far on this, but I've heard that they're starting to uncover historically old Qurans that weren't destroyed, and they are very different from each other, so maybe some of you know something about that. That's not good news if you're interested in the Quran and thinking that's on an equal with the New Testament. Keith Small, an author, a critic, says the history of the transmission just means, as document gets translated and copied on to the next. The history of the transmission of the text of the Quran is at least as much a testament to the destruction of Quran material as it is to its preservation. See, we have a great story of preservation as far as the Gospels go. The Quran has a story of destruction. And so these things that were different got wiped out. We don't know where the original lay. He also said it's a testimony to the fact there never was one original text of the Quran. There are all these variations, very confusing number of variations. So historically, that doesn't sound very good to me. How about Buddhism? Let's try a different religion here. They, I guess, have found some actual scrolls, but they're way after the life of Buddha. We don't have nothing about Buddha until something like 500 years after his life. Now that's a long time, and certain problems can creep in, legends and things like that. So we're not really sure. That's a huge time period compared to the New Testament within the life of these disciples that we have. Let's talk about the Latter-day Saints, right? They've got their Book of Mormon. How do they do as far as manuscripts, and are they on the same par with us? Well, they don't think much of the Bible. One of their leaders said this: who in his right mind could for one moment suppose the Bible in its present form to be a perfect guide? No one can tell whether even one verse of either the Old or New Testament conveys the ideas of the original author. Wow, so he's pretty critical. Well, what did he think about his own Book of Mormon? It was written 1,400 years after the events that it supposedly is talking about. You talk about a huge jump, right? There's an amazing gap there, 1,400 years. It lacks the eyewitness details. There's nothing specific that you can hang on to that comes out of that. And of course, no textual evidence for an ancient Book of Mormon. After all, this Book of Mormon is supposed to be a translation, right, of something earlier. Well, where's that evidence, right? Where's the textual evidence? And there are so many changes in the Book of Mormon. It was called, the most perfect book ever written. Really? Well, why have they had to change so much of it? And why did so much of it get copied from the King James Version? Wait a minute, let's think about that. If it's supposed to be from like the 400s or 500s AD, how can it sound like the King James Version of the Bible, which didn't come out until 1600? And so something's going on there. Doesn't seem to make sense. Let's talk about history of the religion itself. Think about this. How did Christianity get spread? By the sword? No. Christians came along, and what did they do with the Roman Empire? How did they turn the Roman Empire upside down? They took care of people, right? When the children were in trouble, they took care of the children. When people were sick, they took care of them. They took care of women, raised the status of women. And they turned an empire upside down based on love. They went cheerfully to martyrdom and had an amazing witness in these situations and conquered the entire Roman Empire. Compare that to something like Islam. How'd that get spread? Right, with the sword. Convert or die or be a second-class citizen big time. So that's a very different way to spread a religion. How about Scientology? I went to one website, I said legal problems of Scientology. It was a huge website. And it went through the years, and I just abbreviated it up here because it was amazingly long, but they have fought all sorts of court cases, been involved in international court situations, not just some local judge that doesn't like them, Belgium and France and Germany and, of course, the United States. They've been accused of fraud, been found guilty, been accused of running a Ponzi scheme, found guilty, extortion. How about domestic spying? What in the world are they thinking of? But they're involved in the 1970s in the United States, involved with domestic spying. A court judge, right, this fairly neutral person, I would hope, he ruled that their history is, quote, replete with evidence that Scientology is nothing in reality but a vast enterprise to extract the maximum amount of money by pseudo-scientific theories. This is not somebody who's a hostile critic. This is somebody who's an impartial judge that looked at the evidence. I'll put Christianity and its changes and the way it made things happen, I'll put that above Scientology any day. How about some more history? How did Jehovah's Witnesses do? Well, they've been around a while now. How's their track record? How many times did they predict the coming of Jesus and they got it wrong? How about these ideas of transfusions, for example? They were okay at one time, then they're bad. How about worshiping Jesus? It was okay at one time, then it's not right. It was okay to celebrate birthdays, but not now. And so you're always on kind of shifting sand when it comes to the pronouncements of this organization. I don't trust something like that keeps changing things that can kill you, right? As far as transfusions and things like that. Flag salutes, they used to allow flag salutes at one time. How about the Mormons? Have they changed things over the years? Sure. They wanted to become a state back in the 1800s. So what did they do? All of a sudden they had new visions and polygamy was out. Now they could become a state. In the 1970s you had the African American movement in this country, and the blacks were really put down in the Book of Mormon. And so all of a sudden they had new visions, and it was okay for blacks to be part of the priesthood and things like that. So not a good track record of this is what we believe and this is what's always been our position. How about founders of religions? Can we take a look at them for just a second? Muhammad, do we need to spend a lot of time on him? Not a very pleasant individual, man of vengeance. He comes across okay at the beginning because he had no power, and he thought the Jews would accept him, and he thought this thing would just take over the world peacefully, and it didn't happen. The Jews resisted and other people resisted, and that's when he really unleashed a lot of hatred and a lot of bloodshed. Joseph Smith, he had his seer stones, right? He's involved in pretty occult practices there. My favorite story, I guess, is this thing about the Book of Abraham. He claimed that he got this papyrus, and he says, it's Abraham, it's from Abraham. And so he translates, it's all about Abraham and his experiences and all. And that's supposed to be around 2000 BC. And then that papyrus disappears, so nobody has a chance really to know, how legit was it. Well, the fascinating thing is it was found. Maybe some of you know, what's the date on that? Maybe 30 years ago or so? 40? You haven't heard of that? Okay, they came across it. It's the legit thing that he was translating as the Book of Abraham. You know what it is? It's an Egyptian funerary ritual. Just how you bury people and what you do in a funeral service. And it's dated way different than the time of Abraham. This has been proved to be an absolute fraud. And Joseph Smith is the one that translated it and backed the whole thing up. Let's try somebody else, Mary Baker Eddy, the starter of Christian Science. Not a great track record either. I never understood what she meant. She claimed she was being mentally poisoned. That sounds like somebody who's kind of unbalanced to me. She plagiarized her book. She claimed she was healed miraculously, and that was proved to be a fraud. L. Ron Hubbard, he's almost too easy to go after. Because I teach, and I teach literature, I'll never know who sent it to me, but one day, I'm looking at my mail, I had this beautiful, slick, color, rich book about Scientology. Because he started out as maybe some of you know, he's a science fiction author. And so I'm reading this thing, it's beautifully put together. But L. Ron Hubbard, honest to goodness, his life is so different than how it's portrayed here. There's a movie out you might enjoy. I don't know if enjoy is the right word, it'll open your eyes anyway. It's called Going Clear. Did I get it right? That doesn't sound exactly right. I think it's Becoming Clear, Going Clear, but it's the story of L. Ron Hubbard, it's the story of Scientology. Just get that word clear in there, you can probably look it up on Netflix. But in this movie, it's not just an outsider talking about L. Ron Hubbard, but it's people who are in high positions, and we actually get to see videos of them representing the church in court cases and all. Now they've walked away from it. And they give you an interesting idea of what it was really like to be part of this organization. It's just a major con job, and L. Ron Hubbard has had all sorts of difficulties. He ended up exiled, in a sense, from the United States because he had a lot of court issues hanging over his head, and so he just stayed away from the U.S. How about the next two? These are individuals involved with Jehovah's Witnesses, the first two leaders of the Jehovah's Witness organization. Charles Taze Russell believed in pyramid power. Some crazy things never go away. That's still around, isn't it? He sold this stuff called miracle wheat. Again, sort of a con job at the time. He claimed that he was an expert in ancient languages. So he was in a court case one day, and some attorney just plopped down a piece of Greek writing and said, "Could you translate that?" Well, no, he couldn't, because he didn't know any of that stuff. And so he had to admit, yeah, I really don't know any of it. So there's your founder, there's your leader. You're going to match him up with Jesus. We'll talk about Jesus in just a second. Judge Rutherford, who was the follower, the next leader of the group, he was a smuggler during the Prohibition time. Lived the high life. Didn't seem to be a person that you would admire enormously. Let's just take a couple of minutes. All of these people, let's line them up against Jesus. Again, it's pretty unfair. But the uniqueness of Jesus, sometimes I don't think we appreciate. We come and we sing our songs about Jesus, but I don't know if we've ever kind of stepped back and thought about how different he is than all of these other founders. And again, this could be a whole separate talk, but we have the sources we already talked about, far better sources for him than something like somebody like Buddha, as an example. What about some of the prophecies? How many other religious leaders have prophecies that were definite and clear prophecies about his life and his ministry and his death and his resurrection? I bet some of you have some favorites. Are there some places that you've gone to before and you said, wow, that's in the Old Testament that refers to Jesus? You have a couple names, a couple places?
Yeah. Micah 5:2, born in Bethlehem.
Yeah, Micah. And that's, of course, what when the wise men are looking for Jesus, they know, right? Because they open up the Old Testament. So Micah talks about the place. Any others?
Isaiah 53.
Isaiah 53 talks about that suffering servant. And some people try to say, well, maybe it was the nation of Israel. But it doesn't work. If you read it, it doesn't work to say it's a nation. It sounds like an individual. I have heard, and I need to check on that sometime, but I have pretty good sources that have said that in many of the Jewish readings that they go through during the year, they don't do Isaiah 53 because it seems to indicate so clearly Jesus Christ. How about Psalm 22? You looked at Psalm 22? When Jesus is on the cross, he quotes Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you look through that, and it talks about people parting the clothing and gambling for that. It talks about piercing. And they weren't doing crucifixions when David wrote this. So all through the Old Testament are these literally hundreds of prophecies. Jesus, if he comes along and claims to be the Messiah, or people think he's the Messiah, it'd be pretty easy, wouldn't it, to say, no, you're not. You weren't born in Bethlehem. You didn't follow these things that it says in these books. You're not it. But good, religious, pious Jews said, you're it. And they believed in him and went to their deaths because of these, and partially because of these prophecies. How about the events of his life? The birth, the unique birth of this individual. Think about the miracles that he did. In fact, his miracles were so good that even the Jewish Talmud, which was collected later, kind of references by the rabbis about what it meant to be a Jew and the Torah and things like that, it even says Yeshua came along and he was a sorcerer. Well, you know what they're doing at that point, right? If they say he's a sorcerer, what are they admitting? He did miracles. We just don't believe who gave him the power, but we think he was a sorcerer. So they admit it themselves. How about the resurrection itself? Wow. If you know anything about Gary Habermas, he's developed something he calls the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. He says if you just take 5 or 6 key things that generally historians agree on, unless they're really out there someplace, but 95% of historians think Jesus really did die on a cross, that he really was buried, that the tomb really was empty. They're not saying he rose, but they admit that it was empty, that his disciples thought they saw Jesus, that it all started in Jerusalem, this new faith, and that people like Paul and James, who are hostile, became converted. Now you put all those things together, it's hard to think of any other theory like the swoon theory, he just fainted and came to in the tomb, or the disciples stole the body, or they went to the wrong tomb. I mean, none of those theories work very well. They all fall apart because of those minimal facts. They don't address all of the facts. And so I think the resurrection is a very strong indication that it happened the way the Bible has reported it. How about what Jesus said? Let me give you something I think is pretty interesting here. Here are a few things, I just kind of put them all together, of what Jesus said about himself. And honest to goodness, if we heard this coming from a pulpit someplace, we would run from the room because we would think, that can't be, it's just so odd. I'm the bread of life. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. Before Abraham was born, I am, using the term for God. I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Anyone who has seen me has seen who? The Father. Right? You want to see what God's like? Look at me. I and the Father are one. Nobody can make that kind of claim and be taken seriously unless he's got some real credibility in other areas, right? People would run from somebody like that. But Jesus made these kinds of statements. Match that up with Joseph Smith or with Muhammad. I mean, just a wildly different set of things that he said. What about what others have said? Are we just, kind of insular as Christians and we just talk to each other and we're the only ones that think Jesus is unique? Let me give you a couple of quotes here. Napoleon. I know men, and I tell you that Jesus Christ is no mere man. Between him and every other person in the world, there's no possible term of comparison. H.G. Wells, not a believer. In fact, he says, I am not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. He's the most dominant figure in all history. Albert Einstein, I'm a Jew, but I'm enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene. No myth is filled with such life. How about, here's a man, I didn't know anything about him, but he's a French linguist scholar, and he started out as a cynic about the Bible, and after reading a lot of it, he says, whatever may be the surprises of the future, Jesus will never be surpassed, the greatest among the sons of men. And then an American historian, La Tourette, said this, as the centuries pass, the evidence is accumulating that measured by his effect on history, Jesus is the most influential life ever lived on this planet. So these are people who are outside of our faith system, but they're all admitting it. There's something very different about Jesus, something powerfully different. And notice that one person I quoted talked about the impact Jesus had. No other religious leader has had the kind of impact in all these areas. And these aren't all the areas, but these are just some that I was thinking of. The way he's treated the status of women. Hospitals got founded based on him. Universities, the whole university system got started by Christians. Free enterprise, civil liberties, science. People think there's some kind of clash between science and Christianity. Absolutely not. Book after book of people who are honest who look at it say it was because of the Judeo-Christian worldview that science came out of the West. Right? It's not an accident. It didn't start in Asia. It didn't start in Africa. It didn't start in the Middle East. It started in the West because of this belief that we have as Christians. Next point, he has a unique relationship, doesn't he, to his faith compared to the others? Could we take Joseph Smith out of Mormonism? You'd still have Mormonism, right? You've already got his, whatever he said about it, and you have his text now, and you could just live your Mormon life pretty well. Could you take Muhammad out of Islam? Yeah, you just do the 5 pillars and keep track of that. Could you take Buddha out of Buddhism? Yeah, you just do the Eightfold Path and you go on your way. Can you take Jesus out of Christianity? Absolutely not. There's something so pivotal, so important, so crucial. His life is so important. You cannot pull him out of his faith. That's unique among world religions. So the conclusion, as far as Jesus, I think there are only 4 things that you could say about him: liar, a lunatic, one more L, legend, or Lord. Now, C.S. Lewis had 3 of the 4. He didn't use the legend comment, but some people today are trying to suggest maybe it was the Catholic Church in the 300s or 400s that created a Jesus that's powerful, walks on water, and does these miracles. Well, let's take them one at a time. Let's take the first 2 together. A liar or a lunatic. Do you see any problems with that? If Jesus is really those things, that he's thought he was God and he's running around rambling with these kinds of thoughts?
He spoke the truth.
What's that?
He spoke the truth.
He spoke the truth, right? Who's going to stay around somebody that you thought was a lunatic and you're going to devote your life to it and then you're going to devote your death to him? That makes no sense. I'm not going to do that for a lunatic or a liar. If you kept catching him in these lies, you're going to walk away from him. These people devoted years of service to him as this rabbi and then went out and spread this message, suffered terribly because of him. You're not going to do that for those 2 things. What about the legend idea? Well, they've studied legends. It takes much longer to get a legend going than you have, because remember, we have those early manuscripts that are already talking about him as the miracle worker, already talking about him as the resurrection and the life, already talking about him as a virgin birthed person. So you don't have enough time for legend to develop. So what are you left with? He's different than all these other people who are founders of religions. I think he's Lord. But that was point 1. We got 3 more to go. We'll go fast over these, all right? Because I think the facts section here that we talked about, this first thing, is really important, because people in our society today, they'll listen to you if you say, let's talk facts. So that's why I spend more time on that. But I think there are 3 others that we can talk about. One is, how logically consistent is Christianity compared to other religions? Again, we're talking about this testing to match them up with each other. Well, Christianity does pretty well as far as, what are people like? Well, people are, from a Christian perspective, we're better and we're worse than animals, aren't we? We do things much worse than animals do. On the other hand, we do some things, the Olympics, for example, we're in awe of what some of these people do and the kindness that they do. You see the 2 women that fell over each other and the one helps the other one up. Those kinds of things, you're proud to be a human being at those moments. So Christianity says something particular about humans. It talks about the problem that we have, that it's not out there, it's inside us. We're the problem. And that the solution then has to come from the outside, because we're not going to be able to do it ourselves. And that our future, because of the way God's going to see us, that our future is set as Christians. So that's the logical way that Christianity is put together. We'll match that up with some others. I'm just going to run through some questions that people might, I think, obviously ask. Let's take deism, for example. Deism is the Thomas Jefferson God, the clockmaker, right? He wound things up, wound the universe up, put it down, and then he went away. So Jefferson didn't believe in things like miracles, right? So he's got his little Bible, and he, I guess, literally clipped out anything that talked about Jesus performing a miracle, and that was his Bible. That was his New Testament. And so I think you can buy or find versions of that if you want. And basically, it's just Jesus said nice things and then he died. I don't know why you bother, but so yeah, you can get those kinds of Bibles. But here's the problem, right? If God is not interacting with the world, how do you know deism is true? Where did that revelation come from? Right? If God's not revealing anything, where did that come from? How'd you find that out about God? God walked away. How do you know that? Let's try naturalism. That says there is no God. Well, if that's the case, and we're just an accident, and all our mental processes are just evolving and changing, why would you trust that conclusion, right? You're trusting a product of evolution that's not through evolving anyway, and it's just random things firing in your brain. Where's your free will if you're a naturalist, right? If you're just chemicals and neurons firing, there's no free will. Hydrogen atoms don't have any free will. Rocks don't have any free will. But I think all of us feel like we have free will. It seems like that's a problem for naturalism. If you're a naturalist, where do you get a source of morality? Is there any morality for hydrogen atoms? No. Where do these oughts come from? Right? Something outside of us. Let's go to Eastern religions. Let's take a look at them. I've often been puzzled by this, especially the second question up there. Is there some kind of karma machine or something up there that says, well, you did X, Y, and Z, and therefore when you come back, you're going to be this, or you're going to be that, or you're going to be something else, right? I don't, where does that come from? How does that happen? If you're karma, you're building up this karma, who or what's in charge of that? And why don't we remember our past lives? If the whole point is coming back so we become better, I don't remember my past life, do you? I mean, if this system works, right, we should remember and go, oh yeah, I was really cruel to my parents. I'll remember and not do that this time. But I don't get it. It seems like we're on an endless cycle of not learning anything. And why are we evil, right? If there's really this all-being spirit out there, where did evil come from? Why isn't the world getting better, right? If we keep getting reincarnated, aren't we all learning and we're getting better? I don't think we're any better. We got more technology, but we're just more evil technological beings, right? We're not better people. Buddhism says the goal is to get rid of desire, because desire brings problems to us, makes us unhappy. But wait a minute, if you want to get rid of something, isn't that a desire? How about Christian Science? Oh, sickness is an illusion. Really? Why do you have practitioners and why do people die? Mary Baker Eddy is dead. It must not have worked real well with her. Well, you say, well, it's just an illusion, right? You shouldn't trust your senses. Well, if they're untrustworthy, why are we going to read her book and get something out of that book? How about Mormonism? When it comes right down to it, what do they say? Trust the burning in the bosom. But that's subjective, right? It's how you feel that day. You know your own heart, and I know my own heart. I don't trust my own heart. I've been telling myself things that are not true my whole life. And I'm going to base my eternal existence on something that's subjective? That doesn't seem logical. How about number 3? Now we'll move along. Ethics and human nature. How does Christianity do in that area? Well, let's take human dignity and the worth of people. Do we say humans have worth? Yes, we do. Are we up against today a society that's beginning to say, no, it doesn't? Yeah, and so you get groups like PETA that would basically rather save a seal, let's say, than a human child. We're starting to see the loss of human dignity, and Christians have always stood for the value of humanity. I think that's a tremendous ethic to have. And what about the problem of evil? Well, does Christianity have an answer to that? Yes, it does. It doesn't say it's an illusion, right? The Eastern religions say it's an illusion. Maya, right? Everything's an illusion. Well, tell that to somebody who's just lost a child. Hey, it's an illusion. Don't worry about it. That person is torn up inside. That's not going to work. Really, an illusion? No, we say it's real. There really is evil out there. But the good news is God did something about it. We serve the only God who has wounds. Right? You ever think about that? We serve the only God who has. He came into this world, right? He knows about suffering. He's alongside of us. And he says, in the grand scheme of things, this is just a snap of your finger, right? That there's this future out there. If your child is lying there dying, Bertrand Russell once said, he was an atheist, what would you say at the bedside of a dying child? Well, the Christian has much more to say than the atheist, right? The atheist has to say, well, it's too bad. Tough luck. But the Christian says, there's another life, and you're going to see that child again, you'll be reunited with him. There's a powerful story, by the way, in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Faith. Just a horrific story, but an amazing message out of it. It was a man in Massachusetts, I think, somewhere, Massachusetts. He accidentally ran over his own child, and killed her. And as he was telling the story, the video, he's got big tears in his eyes, but he says, I'm going to see her again. And that life, that event brought change in a lot of people's lives. But he has great hope, he has great faith. And he says, I'm going to hug her and she's going to be whole and I'll be with her again. And you can't say that if you're an atheist or an Eastern religion believer. How about some other areas to compare the ethics? Well, let's take the idea of helping others. That's been a part of Christianity forever, hasn't it? That's how it all got started, helping others, looking at those who have less. That's what Jesus talked about. And yet in Eastern religions, what are you doing? You're stepping over those that are suffering because they're paying off their karma. Don't mess with it. So when Mother Teresa comes along and scoops up these broken people, scoops up these ailing people and cares for them. That's the Christian view. I think that's far superior than saying step over them, walk around them, ignore the suffering that's going on. Christianity is not based on works, is it? They make a big point of that in the New Testament. Otherwise, we boast, right? That's what it says in Ephesians. So it's from God. It's the grace of God. What do all other religions say? Do this, do that, do that. And the burden is unbelievable to live that kind of life. Many Mormons are walking away from the faith, for example, because it's just impossible, this list of things that they're supposed to do. Christianity says morality is outside of us someplace, right? There's a God who's established a morality. Otherwise, many religions are saying that we kind of work our own morality out. Well, that doesn't work out very well. Christianity says we're guilty. You ever thought about that? I mean, I don't know about you, but I have a poor self-image because I always think of the things I should do and I don't do them. Or I think of the things that I did do that I shouldn't have done. And I thought maybe that'd get better as I got older, but I feel like I'm more aware of my shortcomings now. So we can't even match up with our own idea of morality, and certainly something like a 10 Commandments, we can't obey the 10 Commandments for, 5 seconds. So we all, I think, not just Christians, we all walk around with this idea that we're not doing as well as we ought to be doing. Others say, no, it's not us. Right? Scientology says you got these engrams, you got to work on these engrams. There's always something on the outside you got to take care of. No, there's something in us, right? We're all broken individuals. That seems more accurate to life. How about finally then satisfaction for the individual? Look at that list, and I don't really have time to explain a lot of it, but Christianity gets rid of that guilt, right? You don't suppress it. You don't go to a psychiatrist and work on it for years and years and years and make that person rich. But Christianity will get rid of it, right? It takes care of that guilt. The guilt is gone. We can face evil and suffering. Satisfies our longings for beauty, for this awe-inspiring idea of a God out there in the universe. I've taught science fiction classes in the past, and science fiction, in a way, it's kind of interesting. It's a substitute for Christianity. You ever think about that? Well, what does science fiction do? The best science fiction movies give you a sense of awe, doesn't it? Because it shows a huge planet out there. It shows this galaxy flying by or something like that. And it tries to give purpose. It doesn't do a very good job of it. Christianity has the real awe. It gives you the whole cosmic view of things. Think about the first chapter in John where Jesus came from and things like that. We get that wonderful sense of beauty, right? There's a world out there that's been created. We're not an accident. The world's not an accident. There really is true beauty that we can appreciate. We can look at the future and see that there's a future out there that's good for us. We can deal with others really well, can't we? Because we're not on a path of doing things and we're further along than other people, so they're obviously not as good as we are. That's not what Christianity says. It says, we have failed, God has come and rescued us, He can rescue you as well. We're not better than anybody else. It's a tremendous equality that Christianity preaches. Secondly, it allows us to experience some amazing things. Miracles, for example. Answers to prayer. We don't have the time, but my guess is you could all tell a story or two about miracles in your lives, answers to prayers that you've seen. We all have shared that. I brought a book with me just to give you an idea. I like this one a lot. It's Jane Rumpf, who wrote a real simple book called Signs and Wonders. And it talks about, we live in I don't know, we're kind of a hardcore cynical group here in the West. We don't really think God is doing things as much as maybe in Africa or in Asia. We hear these stories, we go, well, good grief, that's really great, but we're scientific, it doesn't happen here. Yeah, it does. And here's a book of just dozens of stories of God intervening in powerful ways in people's lives. So if you ever get discouraged or feel a little cynical about what God's up to, there are plenty of things going on. Christianity unites the head and the heart. It gives us hope, but it gives us rational belief. That's what we're here for, right? Apologetics is the head as well as the heart. We're not saying the head's more important, but we certainly have rational belief in the truth of Christianity. And it's hard to live these other religions. And I wanted to tell you a real quick story here. I took this off the internet. It's a young man in his 20s, and his grandmother was an ardent Christian Scientist. Just hardcore Christian Scientist. And then she got very, very ill. And eventually it was to the point they had to get her in the hospital. So I'm going to pick it up at that point. My grandfather and I sat at her bedside for 2 days while she died. Grandma Marie regained consciousness on several occasions. When I spoke to her, looked into her eyes, and sought some comfort or source of strength to deal with her death, all I saw was death and despair. She was dying. She was scared. She didn't know what was going to happen to her. I had no idea what to say to comfort her. I'd never experienced such hopelessness as I experienced in that hospital room. My grandmother expressed to me her fear of death. She sought desperately to cling to life. I didn't know anything I could say or anything to offer her hope in the face of her imminent death. Our local Christian Science church offered no comfort whatsoever. In fact, not one person from the church ever visited us in the hospital. Let me see. They told me later they didn't want their thoughts to interfere with her healing. They told me, but I recognize this is just another sign of the reluctance of church members to face the reality of death. My grandfather sat in the hospital room with me and quoted from Mrs. Eddy, claiming my grandmother was not seriously ill. She'd get up and walk out of that hospital any minute. His heart, however, was not in it. Nobody could listen to my grandmother's increasingly labored breathing and not recognize that she would soon be dead. So that's what's going on in these other faiths. It's really hard to live that life, especially in those crucial moments. You're facing death. And what are you going to say at that time? Are you going to turn to Mary Baker Eddy? There's no solace there. So real quickly summarizing, Christianity is superior in the 4 areas we talked about. And I know I gave you a lot of information. I hope you feel free to contact me for more details on this. Do you remember the story of Peter? Jesus has been telling some hard things to people who are following him, and some of them just walk away. And Jesus turns to Peter and he says, "What are you going to do? You're going to walk away too?" And I thought this is a really good answer for what we've been talking about today. Lord, to whom would we go? Right? Who else has these answers? You have the words of eternal life. So remember the intersection? Well, what we're here to offer, and I hope all of you think about that as you go out in the world the rest of the week, is a new intersection. The intersection of truth and love. So again, I gave you, I think, some resources here. Feel free to email me if you want. I think the easiest one when you want to compare religions is something called So What's the Difference? Very simple. Good book. It's been around a long, long time. And he just talks about the major beliefs of these different systems and compares them to Christianity like I was doing today. So I like that one a great deal. But feel free to email me, Gary@apologeticsforlife.org. I'll send you anything I can, resource lists and things like that. A couple of these other books are really excellent. We've gone through a couple of them in our class. And then str.org is a website for Stand to Reason. Greg Kokel's organization. Got all sorts of things on different religious groups and all that we've been talking about today. And equip.org, which is part of the Christian Research Institute.